So with other vaccine trials, they'll last 10 years because you need to find people with Zika or Ebola in order to recruit into the clinical trials. With SARS-CoV-2, we managed to go through recruitment really quickly because it's so prevalent. So that allowed the trials to move much faster.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Our bodies are wise, but do they also need some help sometimes? Today's guest and I discuss a lot of different topics related to the immune system, like allergies, the microbiome, and autoimmune conditions. And we spend a fair amount of time chatting about how the different COVID vaccines work versus the actual virus. We also discuss some of the reasons that individuals do not want to get vaccinated. You can hear whether we got vaccinated, and you'll get an understanding of where we were coming from in those individual decisions. My goal in inviting today's guest onto the show was not to convince anyone to get the vaccine who doesn't want it, but simply to provide some details about the technologies that went into the vaccines so you can understand them and make your own choice about what to do for your own body and those you care about. My guest today does a great job trying to explain the terms that the average person who is not an immunologist is likely not familiar with. If there's anything good about this pandemic, it's that it's given all of us more ways to learn about how our bodies work. You're listening to the Wisdom of the Body. Today, I'm here with Dr. Azza Gadir, who's an immunologist. She completed her PhD in immunology from the University College London and spent the next 7 years at Harvard Medical School at Boston Children's Hospital, where she published research focused on understanding the immune system and how it protects us from diseases like allergies. Recently, she has worked for biotech companies, exploring how academic research can be used to create innovative therapeutic products. She grew up in London and received a master's degree in the immunology of infectious diseases from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And she is really, really, really great to listen to. And she can take really, really complicated subjects and let normal people like you and me understand them. So I'm so excited, Dr. Gadir, Azza, to have you here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, there's so much I want to ask you about today. So we're going to go all over the place. And I know everybody's going to want to know about vaccines and coronavirus and stuff like that. But we're going to start just a little bit about this field of immunology and, sort of the approach to the immune system. And you chose this as a field of study and a career path, right? You actually chose it, right?
Yeah, I'll say there was a lot of luck that went into it as well, but I can tell you the story very quickly, which is that originally I wanted to be a dentist and I applied and I didn't get the grades, unfortunately, and I was devastated. And I kept asking around dentists and medics at the time, if I want to transfer in, what course should I do as like a gateway in? And a lot of them were saying to me, you should do immunology because it's really difficult and it'll help you grasp dentistry a little bit better. And so I started and I did, my college degree was in biochemistry and immunology. And to be quite honest, I just fell in love with it like a couple of years in and ended up staying. And so, yeah, there was definitely a bit of luck that played into
it. I find that really interesting because for some reason, dentistry is known as being more difficult than immunology.
So the thing about it is that immunology is one module as part of dental school and also medical school. And they get taught it. I'm going to give the cliche, which is that the immune system is very complicated, but they get taught it pretty much in I think a semester or two, and they get blasted with all of this jargon. And so they come out of it thinking, oh, immunology is so complicated and it's so hard to understand. But it's actually, I think a big part of it is just the way that it's taught and that nobody can know everything, right? And so yeah, I think it was interesting because everybody was like, oh, if you start in immunology, then you'll have the basics and you'll find those modules way easier because they tend to be the hardest modules when you are in dental school.
I see. Okay. So how would you define immunology? Or actually, let's even stop there. How would you define the immune system?
So the immune system is, I would say, a complicated but beautifully orchestrated system, and it's a way to protect us from disease. And there are lots of different arms to it, but essentially, historically, kind of the paradigm of health or someone being healthy was the absence of disease. And that's how it was defined, right? You're healthy if you don't have any disease. But actually, the definition is getting a little bit more complicated because of things like the microbiome, which we can get into in this conversation. But at the base of it, your immune system serves to protect you from getting sick.
That makes sense. And the Ayurvedic definition of health, I'd like to share it with you actually, because it sounds a little bit similar to what you're talking about. Have you learned about Ayurveda before?
Just a little bit, but I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So, well, if you've heard about a dosha, which is essentially the humors of the body, right? So the blood, the mucus, the air, the five elements, it's an indigenous system. So it's more simple. It doesn't use the periodic table of elements. A healthy person is going to have doshas that are balanced. So not, too much or too little mucus, or not too much or too little red blood cells, like that kind of thing. And you're going to have regular hunger that's not too strong or not too weak or erratic or anything like that. You're going to have properly formed tissues, and then you're going to have a mind, a soul, and senses that are full of bliss and able to properly perceive the environment. So it's interesting because, like, when I think about immunology, to me, that feels really similar to that definition of health.
Yeah, it's definitely similar in that there's like lots of different parts that are played. But I think that the main thing, like there are definitely different arms to it. And that's definitely, I think, reflected in the Ayurvedic definition as well. But the thing that's really interesting, I think, about the immune system that can often get lost in, I roll the media, but in general, I think in general discourse, is that it's so context dependent, right? And I think that's something that I'm sure you also factor into your practice, where it's just like very context dependent. Like, for example, the type of immune responses that you might want if you have an infectious disease, for example, might not be the ideal set of immune components that you want if you had cancer or if you had autoimmunity. There's just so many different layers to it. And I remember I once went to a conference where this guy started his talk by saying that, again, the immune system is very complicated because if it wasn't, infectious viruses and bacteria would have worked out a long time ago how to evade us and wipe us all out. And so it's just like an interesting way of thinking about it, because it's kind of true that we've evolved to have all of these different layers so that to kind of protect us from, to like keep it a little bit complicated so that these kind of infectious pathogens can't just, beat one mechanism and then have one out, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love it. And actually, is the immune system's job only to kill things that are potentially harmful to us, or is there more to it?
So the immune system is actually ideal. What you want is a well-balanced one, right? You want homeostasis. And so you want everything to be in a good balance. And so unfortunately, I think we've tried multiple times in the past to kind of define what the perfect healthy immune system looks like. But I think no two immune systems look the same. There are obviously different factors. We know that genetics plays into it. Definitely environmental does as well. Absolutely food as well, which I know is something that you probably spend a lot of time thinking about. And there isn't just like a one size fits all perfect immune system, right? It's all about having a balance. And so your immune system doesn't just serve to kill things and remove it. Actually, if you think about it like a balance, right? If you think about it like a swing, if it's weight on one side, that's when, if you're infected with something like a virus or a bacteria, etc., your immune system will activate inflammatory responses to kill those things and get it out. But once those things are cleared out of your system, there needs to be signals sent to your immune system to also just stop fighting. This thing is gone, right? And so you want that balance to come back to the center. And when it weighs to the other side is when you can get inflammatory responses that can persist or they can continue. And then you'll get things like autoimmunity or allergies, right? It's when your immune system is perceiving things that are innocuous or it shouldn't be attacking as bad. And then you start to get these inflammatory responses that are targeted towards your own self tissue. And so in answer to your question, it's not all about killing things. It's actually about maintaining that homeostasis and maintaining that balance.
Yeah, and I think you also really highlighted that context piece about the inflammatory responses needing to be engaged at certain times and then the signs that need to be sent to turn them off. So thank you for mentioning that. And It seems to be like there are a lot of things that the immune system gets activated from. And you were just mentioning kind of the whole autoimmune thing. And what would cause a body to not be able to see that, hey, this is my body, I shouldn't attack it?
So there are multiple factors to it. And actually, I'll tell you that a lot of the work that I was doing, the lab that I was in Boston, worked specifically on a type of cell called the regulatory T cell. It's actually my favorite cell. And the reason for it is because this is actually a type of T cell that is, you won't find it in huge numbers, right? There isn't a high frequency of it, but its responsibility is actually to inhibit other cells. And so it's a type of cell that has been associated with, when it doesn't work, with things like autoimmunity or on a local level, allergies in the gut, because these cells are typically, and they're just one aspect of a really complicated system, but a set of cells that will essentially keep that balance in the middle. They get induced to tell your immune system to calm down, stop. You shouldn't be attacking this thing. It's okay. And when they don't work is when you can start to see these inflammatory responses that get driven towards self-tissue. And the other reason why I really like them is because they kind of shift that health paradigm a little bit, where it's no longer like being healthy is no longer the absence of disease, but you start to realize that the immune system itself has very active responses that it activates in order to maintain that homeostasis. So it's not like a passive response, and that's why you're healthy. It's that you have these mechanisms like regulatory T cells that get activated to suppress the immune system. But I mean, to answer your question directly, when it comes to things like allergies or even autoimmunity, one of my PhD supervisors used to say that it's just unfortunate that you would be dealt a bad hand, meaning that we know that there are multiple factors at play. So it's genetics play a part. We know that environment plays a part. We know that diet plays a part. And so all of these things together, you kind of get them all coming together at the right time. And then what you get is the accumulation of all of those things together can then drive whether somebody is likely to develop an autoimmune condition or even things like allergies.
I'm so glad that you mentioned allergies, actually, because I wanted to ask you about that, because you've done a lot of research on allergies. And I don't think a lot of people think of them as a disease because they're so common. It's like you could just go to the store and buy some over-the-counter remedy. You're like, oh, this time of year, it's my time of year to have a stuffy nose and itchy eyes or whatever. So I guess if it's a disease, is there an understanding of the process? I mean, you just mentioned that genetics, environment, and diet play a part in the generation of a condition, but is there an understanding about the process that leads to allergies as a disease specifically?
Yeah, and I'm glad actually that, because I think the important thing, first of all, that I'll say is that a lot of people confuse allergies and intolerances, right? So the main thing to remember, like the difference between the two, is that an intolerance is not an immune response. It's when you get like gastrointestinal discomfort, right? And the main way to tell is that then intolerances are not life-threatening. And typically you can have very small amounts of that food, but if you increase it, that's when you'll start to get, maybe constipation, diarrhea, or other symptoms, and gastric distress in general. Allergies are an immune response. And so they do have a very clear definition. So allergies are basically when your immune system is mounting inflammatory responses to things that are innocuous, typically to the majority of people. And so when it comes to food allergies, it's that, you could eat whatever you want, but for some reason in people who have like a peanut allergy, they come into contact with peanut and their body is like, this thing is bad. And then they start attacking. And so a lot of the work that I was doing in the lab was around food allergies in particular, and this concept of tolerance. So when we were talking earlier, Heather, about the things like autoimmunity and allergies, you can kind of think of them as the immune system getting a break in tolerance, like it's no longer able to tolerate things. And so with allergies, when you get that break in tolerance localized in the gut, that's when you'll get things like food allergies, right? Like for some reason, like you eat that peanut or you're exposed to like other foods that you're allergic to, and you get full immune responses activated. And so that's anything from like, anaphylaxis. So that's throat constriction. It's like hives, it's itching, it's diarrhea. Depending on the severity of the food allergy. But when you get like a more systemic break in tolerance, that's when you'll get things like lupus or like rheumatoid arthritis, which affects like multiple joints, etc. And so we know that there are like multiple factors at play and contribute. But the story that I in particular was focused on was a microbiome story, which was really cool because I really like the microbiome. I think during my PhD, I worked on lupus patients mainly, or like I'm not an MD, so we would go to a clinic once a week that the medical doctors that we worked with would kind of have these lupus patients come in and they would see them and then they would draw blood from them to check their labs and check their course of disease. And so we would get to, as PhD students, once a week go and actually take blood. So we were trained as phlebotomists and we would take blood from these patients in order to get, and then ask them, can we get a little bit extra for research? And, the majority of them would say that that was fine. But it was interesting because you'd get to know these patients, right? It's not like, it's just like invisible people and you're just getting their samples. And it was difficult because I think for a really long time, it was really difficult for the medical industry in general or for medics to measure an anecdote, right? And anyone who has an autoimmune disorder or has a disease that's like immune driven will tell you that they can be quite unpredictable. And the anecdote does matter, right? Like you ask them, like they have to limit their stress. They can tell that when they're a little bit stressed, that sometimes they get a flare in disease, etc. So I remember that during my PhD, we would talk about how it's really clear that these anecdotes do matter, but it's just hard. It's hard to measure them because there are just so many factors at play, like how you're sleeping, what you're eating, etc. And so the reason why I really like the microbiome is I think it's a way for both Eastern and Western medicine to meet in the middle, where the microbiome it's because it's so sensitive to environment, right? In terms of its function and its presence, that it basically provides kind of the medical industry with a way or a potential way to measure those anecdotes. I mean, the science isn't there currently, but like I think in future we will get to the stage, or I hope we will get to the stage where you'd be able to take a fecal sample from someone as a measure of their gut and be able to start to predict or be able to see certain lifestyle choices and certain things that might be triggering flares. And so, so I really enjoyed doing my postdoc and I really liked that it ended up being a microbiome story.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there's this idea in Ayurveda that, the microcosm is a reflection of the macrocosm. And I can't help but think about that every time I talk about the microbiome. And I know there's always more than we all can understand in our puny little minds, especially my mind's very puny. So it seems like maybe that's part of the way of coming together. There's a lot of personification that happens when we talk about the bugs, like the bugs like to do this, the bugs like that. And I think that part of the reason I like talking about the microbiome is because I think it also helps people have more awareness of their own body. One of the things that's so fascinating to me is that the digestive system, the space inside the digestive system actually isn't even your body. It's just an environment in the same way that the space around you in the room you were in is that environment. And then you have this skin that lines it and you have secretions that are on the surface and things like that. So it's super fascinating, the microbiome. And I know that there's this whole focus of germ theory versus terrain theory, and we could talk about probably a lot about, how the microbiome affects us and how we affect the microbiome. But first question is, are both bacteria and viruses included in the microbiome, or is it just bacteria?
Yeah, so the word microbiome actually refers to the set of genes that code for any microorganism that lives in or lives inside you or on your surface. And so that actually includes fungi as well and viruses. So you have a virome, you have a fungome, and then you have like the bacteriome as well. So all together, that all compiles what your microbiome is.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because technically a virus isn't even a living organism, right? Because it can't live on its own unless it has a host.
Yeah. So viruses, this is a conversation that I actually really enjoy having, but it's that viruses themselves, just by nature of what they are, and I'm going to caveat this by saying that the majority of viruses that exist out in the world are actually super okay, right? Like they don't do anything to us. They're not, pathogenic or harmful. It's just on occasion we'll get an infectious one like SARS-CoV-2, for example. But the viruses in general will hijack cells in order to make more of themselves. So they'll go into a cell, they'll hijack the cell's machinery in order to make more of their own proteins and assemble themselves. And then they're released from the surface and then they'll go on to infect others. But yeah, in general, viruses, they can't survive outside of a cell. They need like a home.
Okay, yeah, I was curious about that because then I also heard about microchimerism a couple of years ago, and that blew my mind. And I guess when I think about all the little cells that we have inside us and all the little organisms that we have inside us, we have some cells that are like Heather cells and Azza cells. And then we have other cells that are not Heather and not Azza in our bodies. And then we have like other human cells that can also be living in our bodies, which is super fascinating. And it's a lot for the immune system to try to keep track of and figure out what should be going where.
Yeah. And sometimes, when you really get into the weeds of it and you think about like how multi-layered it is, like sometimes I think, holy crap, there's so much that could go wrong that actually doesn't. You know what I mean? You think that there are so many different moving parts and there's just so much. And then also I think just going back to the topic of the microbiome, something that actually ended up what my research project ended up being, but we kind of built on work that was done by other groups where we found that those same cells that I mentioned earlier, the regulatory T cells, the reason why bacteria able, or like this is one hypothesis that we built on, is that the reason why bacteria are able to live on your surface or live on your gut, for example, and not actually cause any harm, right? Like your immune system isn't recognizing them as bad. If you're peanut allergic, it'll recognize a peanut as bad, but it's not recognizing the majority of these like trillions of microbes as bad, is because one of the mechanisms they employ is that actually they induce regulatory T cells in the immune system that are specific to them. And then those cells will inhibit your immune responses. So they'll essentially say, hey, don't attack this guy, he's good, And so it just shows you the level to which we've co-evolved with all of these organisms, that actually our immune systems and them, they communicate directly with each other. And it's a very like kind of fine-tuned balance, which is fascinating.
It is fascinating. And the more I learn about immunity, I think there is intellect there. That's intelligence. That's happening. And I can't help but think that there's this connection between intellect and immunity. All right. So I know everybody wants us to talk about the coronavirus.
Let's do it.
Okay. So we've talked a little bit about just in general, the kind of background on immunity, and me being, I guess you could call me an alternative healthcare practitioner of some sort, or holistic practitioner that is often viewed as alternative. A lot of people, first of all, assume that I would be more, I would say, like anti-vaccine. And I actually did get the vaccine. I got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But I have a lot of people that say things like, if I take care of myself and I keep my immune system strong and I have, good health behaviors, and that results in me having good health, then why do I need to get a vaccine? So what would you say to a person who is saying that question or asking that?
The best way is to explain, first of all, the perfect cascade of events that you want to happen when you get infected with something. So I just want to outline something very quickly, which is that typically, like when you're born with really good innate immune responses, right? But you can think of your adaptive immune responses, and I'm going to define them in a second, which are your later immune responses, as being kind of a dictionary. So you have your innate immune responses, and then that dictionary of your immune system life is blank, okay? And so what happens is that millions of times a day, things will go in through your nose, through your eyes, through your mouth, through other openings in your body. And your innate immune system, which is, you can think of it kind of like as very non-specific and early and immediate responses, are actually incredibly effective at clearing things out of the body millions of times a day without any issue. The majority of us don't get sick all the time because your innate immune system is there. Something comes in through your nose, it will start hauling punches at it. It'll just say, hey, there's something in the body, let's get this out, and it'll start hauling punches at it, right? And your innate immune system has multiple cells in it, like just to name a few, there's like dendritic cells, for example, and other types of cells, and they all do different things in different tissues in your body. But what happens is that on occasion, your innate immune response will get overwhelmed. So something will come into the body and it'll say, hey, there's this thing in the body, and then it'll start to recruit other cells to the site, and they're all throwing punches, and they're just, whacking at this thing with baseball bats and being like, get out, we're trying to kill you. And then after a couple of days, it'll realize actually that it can't get this thing out and it's overwhelmed. So what it does is that you have cells called antigen presenting cells, and they will grab a little bit of the offender and they will run to your lymph nodes and they will present it to your adaptive immune response. And this is your later immune and much more specific immune response. And these are the immune responses that include things like T cells and B cells that make antibodies. And so these antigen presenting cells grab a little chunk, run to your lymph nodes, and they'll say, hey guys, this thing is in the body and we can't get it out. Start training. And so then what you have is that over the next few days, you'll start to get T cells. And I mean, I love this process. I think it's very cool. So if you want to dig deeper into it, I would love to. But you start to get T cells in the lymph nodes and B cells that will start to make more of themselves specific to that thing. Right. And so this is what we call antigen specificity. So so B cells will they'll like lock and key, and they'll find versions of themselves and that make antibodies that are specific to that thing that's being presented to them. And the T cells will have receptors on their surface that are also specific to that thing. And then after a while, they get released and they rush out to the site, and your T cells will take out any cell that is infected. They're very specific. They don't even hit uninfected cells. And your B cells will make antibodies that will rush out, and they will find bits of virus that are outside of the cell and stick to the surface in order to make that bit of the offender more digestible by the immune system and more recognizable, and then it'll get chomped away. And so the beautiful thing about your adaptive immune responses is that is that not only are they specific, so they're antigen specific, so they recognize specific things, but the other part of it is that they come with memory. So meaning that after the offender is cleared out of the system and they say, hey, the coast is now clear, they go and they hide away in parts of your immune system, like your bone marrow, for example. And then in future, if you were ever to encounter that same offender, you don't have to go through that entire process and get swollen lymph nodes and get sick and have symptoms. They're just ready to go, and they rush out and they get rid of that thing without you having to go through the whole process. And so in answer, it was a very long-winded way of answering your question, but this is kind of the ideal set of events that you want to have. And when I was talking earlier about the dictionary, it's that like when you're born and you have that like blank, all of those blank pages, every time you encounter an antigen from when you're younger, you start to build a library of antibody responses and memory responses into that dictionary. And so that's actually the entire rationale and definition of what a vaccine is or what vaccinations are. They're essentially, the very base of their definition, a way of showing your immune system something so that if it ever were to encounter it, like out in the wild, that it has all of those memory responses ready and waiting, and that you don't have to get sick, right? And they're ready to go. And I think I already know what your next question is going to be, which is, so why are vaccinations better than, quote unquote, natural infection, like that natural exposure?
Well, before we go there, because I think that is the next question, but just in case the audience is a little lost, just to summarize in like sort of the Cliff's Notes version is that you have two parts of your immune system, the innate and the adaptive, and the innate immune system is the part that essentially is from when you were born. Does that go up to a certain age that is being developed?
Your innate immune responses are just always there. They're there with you, but you can think of them as like immediate, non-specific response to things trying to make you sick.
I see. Okay, good. Yeah. And so they're essentially trying to take care of the job and then get everything cleared out and then can retain the memory, allow the body to retain the memory of, you know what, next time this thing comes around, I know exactly what to do with it so that this body does not get sick. Sound about right?
So exactly. So your innate immune responses essentially are your early immune responses that will kick in to help you out multiple times a day, right? And they're just a constant that you have in your life. Your adaptive immune responses that are only triggered every now and again when your innate immune system gets overwhelmed, it's that portion of the immune system that comes with memory and specificity that can protect you long term. So if you ever were to encounter that thing, you have those cells ready to go. And so that's why, even if, in answer to your question, even if you are incredibly healthy and you have a very well-balanced lifestyle and you exercise lots, etc., you don't have to forego vaccinating as well, because essentially you can do all of these things. But then also when there's an infectious organism like SARS-CoV-2, for example, if you vaccinate against it, you're basically just putting those cells and having them in your back pocket so that if you encounter the virus, they can rush out and help you. So I think my point is that vaccinations are essentially not a way, they don't change your immune system. They're actually presenting something to your immune system to let it do something that it does for you anyway, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And the vaccine essentially allows the body to develop the well, I'm not going to use the technical terms because I can't retain them. It's like, you probably trying to learn Sanskrit, that the body retains the memory of what to do when it comes in
Exactly.
contact with that again. And that's really the ownership piece. The ownership piece is not that now I have this thing in me that is stored in me, this foreign thing.
Exactly. So it's that you have your antibodies that are already in your system and your T cells, and they've just honed themselves to be more specific to this thing. And then now you have them in your, quote unquote dictionary in your back pocket. And if you ever were to encounter that virus ever again, they'll just rush out immediately without you having to go through the process all over again.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I know there are a lot of different approaches I would say people have taken to wanting to build their immunity, we'll say. Certainly the diet and lifestyle, and just taking care of yourself, and then vaccines is another thing. But I also know of people who have intentionally tried to expose themselves to the virus so that they will get it. And this actually is some younger people that I know that were all flying Tulum and having these like big parties. But eventually it's like, okay, to have the antibodies in your body so that when you come in contact with this thing, which seems pretty much inevitable that it's going to happen unless you want to keep living in a bubble, that you have the ability to handle that.
So to go back a little bit, the reason why I think COVID-19 in particular as a disease is something that when it kind of emerged last year, other than the fact that it was incredibly infectious, right, which is when everybody started freaking out about it, the other piece to it is also just the unpredictability of it, meaning that allowing yourself to be naturally exposed, right? You can't control the viral load that you're exposed to, right? Because we know that that matters. You can't control how your immune system will respond to it, because we know that there are some people who have undiagnosed, very minor, genetic changes that actually meant that they weren't able to mount some of the immune responses that they needed. And so even though the survival rate was pretty high, right? I think it was like, depending on where you were, over 98% or over 97%. The issue, and the thing that actually for me personally about this virus that kind of concerned me wasn't whether if I got it, whether I would survive or not. It was that a substantial number of people who get naturally infected, because it's so unpredictable, a substantial number of people actually don't mount memory responses, or for some reason are able to get reinfected. And so maybe they didn't get sick enough, like who knows, maybe their innate immune system wasn't overwhelmed enough. There's a bunch of reasons for it, but a substantial number of people weren't able to maintain that memory and could continue to get infected and also pass on the virus. But the other piece about it that I think for me concerned me was this long COVID. So meaning that some of the modeling has it at up to like 35% of people, regardless of age and regardless of how like healthy they are, even after their immune system cleared the virus. So even after the virus was no longer detectable in their bodies, actually was still maintaining at least one symptom months and months afterwards. And it seems like, I'm sure most of us have heard about long COVID, right? Like long COVID survivors and people that have it. And it's just, it really reduces your quality of life, meaning that a lot of people can't go back to work. The symptoms range between full body fatigue to like other kind of autoimmune like symptoms like joint pain, chronic headaches. Tinnitus is another one. I have a friend who actually has that currently, and it's just, it's really not fun. And so I think the piece to it that kind of, and we can talk a little bit more about like why vaccination exposure differs from that. But the long COVID piece with natural infection is the reason why, for me, it was concerning. And I just personally wouldn't recommend to anybody that's in my network to go and get naturally infected. It's because that unpredictability, and also because of, the potential that you could actually develop long COVID, which is really not fun to have.
If you want to create a more receptive body free from toxins, inflammation, and metabolic issues, would it be crazy for you to explore booking an Ayurvedic consultation with me? There's probably never been a more perfect time to do it. Every day you wait matters when it comes to your health. So if you're ready to get your body back in balance, I'll give you a 30-day plan to get you started. Go to heathergrish.com to book a consultation. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. Right, because it's essentially when you get COVID, your immune system is going to be doing its work and producing the necessary materials to fight it and get rid of it and all these things. But the other part of it is that you might have other responses that are overreacting in your body that don't necessarily need to get set off if you weren't to come in contact with something that your body perceives as so harmful.
Exactly. And I was also going to say that, I mean, we know this, right, from other viral infections, that we know that viral infections are able to trigger other trigger symptoms.
The reason I got the vaccine is because I viewed it as building a tolerance to something, and that essentially like training my body were it to come in contact with this thing that is going to be likely perceived by my body as stronger, more potentially harmful than this vaccine would be to my body, that my body would then be ready to handle the actual virus better because of that training. I view it as training.
That's exactly what it is. It's basically just showing it something so it can train. And that's exactly how you should think about it. And actually, the other thing that I think is important to define is that exactly what it is that's in these vaccines, right? So I'm sure all of us have seen those photos of the SARS-CoV-2 virus where it's like a ball with red things on it and things coming out of it that look like crowns. And so when you get naturally infected, you breathe it in through your airway, it binds to receptors in your airway and then is internalized into cells. And then the virus itself will hijack, like we mentioned earlier, machinery inside of the cell in order to make more of itself, and then it bursts out and goes on to other cells to spread. So basically, the point is that it means that your immune system with natural infection sees all of the virus. It sees the spike protein of the virus, it sees the nucleocapsid protein, all of the different elements of the virus are exposed to the immune system. However, we worked out about, actually, I'll just quickly define that when your immune system sees all of these different parts, while it might mount antibody responses, for example, not all of those antibodies are neutralizing, meaning that not all of those antibodies are helpful. You can also get binding antibodies, is what we call them, which are like antibodies that will be mounted, for example, to the N protein in the virus that don't neutralize. They're basically just like duds, like they'll cling on, but they don't really do anything and they don't really help the immune system recognize anything, right? And so when this virus, emerged December 2019, we had data from other coronaviruses, so SARS and MERS, who you can think of kind of like a cousin to this virus. But we had data from other coronaviruses that basically indicated that while the immune system can see, quote unquote, all of the different parts of the virus, it was only remembering the spike protein. So meaning that the T cells and the neutralizing antibodies and B cells that you were generating were only generated specific to that spike protein, right? Which is the protein that's protruding out the surface of the virus. So that's why all of the vaccines that have currently been authorized in the US are all some version of showing your immune system that spike protein. And we can go into the technology a little bit if you would like, but I just wanted to mention that to say that that's the main difference. The reason why vaccine immunity is way more robust and more impressive than natural immunity. And we have data now, like if you look at the research papers, they always compare the memory responses from vaccines to the memory responses you get from being naturally exposed. And you can always see in these graphs that the antibodies are like through the roof with the vaccines and the T cell responses are through the roof. And the reason why the vaccines are so much better is because, again, we just took the spike protein, we concentrated it, it's in the vaccine, and that's what your immune system is seeing and mounting responses to. And you don't have any of the other bits of the virus to kind of confuse the process.
It's interesting. I don't know how old you are, but I'm in my mid 40s and I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of somebody who is 25 years old and they're like, well, I'm not going to get sick if I get the vaccine. I'm not going to get sick if I get the virus anyway. I remember when the pandemic first started, I was in Whole Foods and in line, and it was when everybody was, still very traumatized because it was the very early beginning of the pandemic. And this pack of teenagers walked by and they had masks on. Everybody had masks on at the time. And they were laughing and going, well, it's not us that's going to die. And that really, really stuck with me. And I guess because I remember when, certain viruses went on, when I was younger, more so in Asia. And I remember never being afraid of a virus, but things were different for me with this particular virus. I definitely felt like the risk levels are higher because of my age and things like that. But I wonder, if I'm 25 years old, would I want to get this vaccine? And am I only going to get this vaccine if I view it as me doing something good for society? Or is there, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think that this is why the question you asked earlier is really relevant about viruses needing to be inside things. So the most important thing I think also to remember, right, is that viruses mutate by nature of what they are. And it's actually very rare that those mutations will result in them behaving differently or doing something differently. But the point is that the longer that viruses have to linger inside bodies, even if that's really healthy bodies, but the longer that this virus has to linger around, the more likely it is that we're going to start to see mutations that will result, because there'll be like way more mutations, right? So it's like a numbers game. So it's likely that we'll start to see mutations that will arise on the spike protein that will affect the way that your memory responses are able to bind, right? Saying that, our immune systems are incredibly robust. Like I will tell you that all of the data so far is showing that the memory responses that you get from vaccinating are still able to protect from all of the variants of concern that have been identified in the world. And when we say variants of concern, we say that these are variants that have mutations that are like getting really creepily close to affecting binding of memory responses, right? But they're not quite there yet. It's just every time you hear about a new variant of concern, it's not panic, but it's just concerning because it means we're getting closer. And especially when you have uncontrolled spread. And so that's why I would say, to answer that question, my general advice to people, and even young people in my network and friends and family, is for them to absolutely vaccinate, because the only way we're going to come out of this pandemic is to make sure that if people get infected, if they're vaccinated, they have those memory responses. And as I mentioned earlier, with natural infection, a substantial number of people actually don't mount memory, right? So if you can get reinfected, you're continuing to give this virus a home to mutate in. And so I would say that like, you're not just vaccinating to protect yourself from things like long COVID, given that the statistics might be on your side in terms of things like hospitalization and death, but you're also vaccinating in order to kind of help the collective community get this virus out so we don't see the emergence of new variants that could be problematic. And so, yeah, so I would say that that would be my answer to it, is that this is double-sided. It's don't forget about things like long COVID that can impact you, but also think about how if you're vaccinated and you get infected, then you don't have to worry about contributing to newer variants emerging, and we could be out of this pandemic just way faster.
Got it. Yeah. And I know that we've already had some discussion about the vaccine and menstrual cycle discussions that have been going on. And I would say a disrupted, intense period after getting the vaccine, which I've been very public about. And I also did go on the VAERS website and check out the data of what people are reporting on their adverse reactions to the vaccines. I did have the J&J vaccine. I don't know if that matters, but I just want to sort of briefly touch on that, because obviously anything we do to our bodies as women can affect our menstrual cycle. Like you eat kimchi for 3 meals a day for a week, and that's going to give you a super heavy period. There's like things that, especially if you do certain things during different phases of the menstrual cycle too, it's going to affect your body differently. And you actually pointed out to me that it's a well-known fact that many vaccines will affect a woman's menstrual cycle, and it had something to do with progesterone. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think first of all, I want to say that I think concerns about fertility is something that comes up, and as it should, right? We all know that like the history of medicine hasn't always been good at like differentiating men and women and like the way that different things can impact you. So just, that lack of data, I think also drives a lot of distrust, that people just don't think that, people care about women's health, which history would tell you that that's not far from the truth. Would like to think it's changing, but yeah. So I just want to start there, but I also just want to address where a lot of the fertility rumors came from. So if you remember, so just now we were discussing how the vaccines show your body the spike protein, right? And then you start to mount those memory responses, okay? And so this was a rumor that emerged because there was a lab study that looked at other proteins in the human body that share amino acids with the spike protein. And so what they found in this study is that there was a protein called syncytin 1 that's a placental protein that shares a few amino acids with the spike protein, right? And so they hypothesized, it was a hypothesis that would mean that the body might be able to get confused and start targeting syncytin 1. And then that would cause issues, right? So first of all, just a couple of things on this. So first of all, fertility mechanisms aren't necessarily placental. And so just the hypothesis there was just the connection to fertility was just a little ropey. But second of all, we only have so many limited amino acids, right? So your immune system doesn't recognize amino acids. It recognizes the way a protein is folded. It sees shapes. And we already know that like the spike protein and the syncytin 1 protein are not shaped similarly. And also we have data from people who got naturally infected with SARS-CoV-2. We didn't see that effect. We didn't see antibodies, antibodies being mounted to syncytin 1, right? So this lab study was one paper, and now we have 1 billion people vaccinated worldwide, and we know that we haven't seen this. We haven't seen antibodies to this protein. It's not a mechanism that's happening. But this is essentially where this kind of rumor started. But I'll tell you that at this point, and we have an immense amount of data, and a lot of this is just science being very careful, but we have an immense amount of data that shows that these vaccines actually do not impact fertility whatsoever. So what is that data? So in the vaccine clinical trials, they were actually advised not to get pregnant because we don't typically include pregnant women in clinical trials, but there were a lot of accidental pregnancies. And I think actually at this point, there have been about 5,000 pregnancies after vaccination that are being monitored in one study, right? And none of those pregnancies had any issues, and none of those people had any issues in fertility compared to the general population, because that's what you want to see. Because when you're vaccinating this many people at this scale, you're going to pick up some events that would have happened anyway. And so when this stuff comes up, you want to compare and see, is it likely that these events would have happened anyway? And so we now have a lot of data. And actually, Heather, I'm happy to send you a fact sheet that can outline some of these studies in case helpful for any of your listeners if they want to kind of see the breakdown. But we have people who got accidentally pregnant who weren't intending to after they were vaccinated. All of those people are doing fine so far. We also have the people that are being monitored in the trial. We also have a lot of animal data that's now been done showing that there is no impact on fertility or on the course of pregnancy in things like rats. But we also have a lot of healthcare workers opted in just because of risk benefit, meaning that if they were going into the hospital and their risk of getting SARS-CoV-2 infected was super high, they were like, I want to take my chance and just get the vaccine. And actually, I think in the US, we currently have about, I want to say, as of the 16th of April, 94,000 pregnant people who opted in to get vaccinated. And there were no events reported or adverse events reported compared to the general population. Even things like miscarriages, bleeding, cramping, preterm birth were not higher than what was seen in, people who are not vaccinated who are also pregnant. And then the last thing actually that I'll mention is that there is a trial that came out of Israel in the last couple of weeks that had a small subset. I think it was about 25 people, but they actually looked at egg quality. So they looked at fertility hormones. They directly looked at egg quality pre and post vaccinations and showed no impact whatsoever. And so in answer to your question about the menstruation, so this has been noted with other vaccines like flu shots, for example, and we're not entirely sure of the mechanism, but we do know that these effects are transient. There's a couple of hypotheses that have been presented. And so I want to first confirm and say that this is something that has been noted in a substantial number of people, not in all women actually, but in a lot of women, that after their vaccine, they noticed either heavy bleeding or spotting or their period coming earlier. And the hypothesis around this, and there are actually a couple of reproductive immunologists in academia exploring this question currently, but the whole hypothesis is that it's more related to the fact that when you do get vaccinated, similar to natural infection, but on a smaller scale, you do have this inflammatory cascade that's triggered, right? Like you get your innate immune responses activated, they activate your adaptive immune responses, but these are still inflammatory responses. So, people will get expected events like inflamed lymph nodes or a headache, or they might get aches and pains because they are mounting those responses. And so all of this mechanism is tied into fever and changes in body temperature. So one of the hypotheses is that change in body temperature is affecting progesterone release, and that's what's impacting all of the changes in menstruation. And so I guess my point is that we know from other vaccines that these effects are transient. This is not the same mechanisms and set of mechanisms that are involved in fertility. And then in terms of fertility, we have a huge amount and burden of data that shows that these vaccines do not. And I would actually say to just remember that as opposed to treatments which you take repeatedly over time, a vaccine is one shot, right? You're showing it to the immune system. We know that with the messenger RNA vaccines, for example, the messenger RNA stays in your system for 24 hours. And we can talk about how it works, but the protein, the spike protein itself only sits in your system for about 72 hours. And then it's wiped out. It's used up by your immune system. And so these are like very short-term responses. And then your immune system does its thing. So there isn't an expectation that it would even make biological sense for there to be like a persistence that would impact things like fertility.
Yeah. And I think that the vaccine manufacturer has been pretty clear about people not conceiving during the month in which they get the vaccine, unless that's changed. I remember hearing that that was the guidance in the beginning.
Yeah, that was the guidance in the beginning, but I think now it's more risk benefit. So for example, if I was somebody who was on a fertility journey and I was out and about, right? Like I have a job, which means that I have to be out in public or I'm an essential worker or something that's putting me at high risk, I personally would make the decision to get the vaccine because, again, that's exposing me in a controlled setting to mount those responses. And it's lower risk than if I were to get SARS-CoV-2 or get infected naturally. I actually personally have a few friends that are on IVF journeys that opted in to get the vaccine and they did okay. But I think that this is a personal decision for people and it depends on your comfort level.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting is, can you think of a case that, or anyone who you'd want to be, I guess, careful about the timing of the vaccine specifically, any sort of health conditions that you would want people to be careful about?
Yeah, so I think that a couple of things, and I think less related to timing, it's that if you have a history of anaphylactic reactions, right? So in the messenger RNA vaccines, they have one ingredient called polyethylene glycol, which is actually just a lipid. It's a fat. And it's in everything. It's in body lotions. It's in creams. It's in, if you were allergic shower gel, like if you were allergic to it, you would most likely know by the time you're an adult. And people who have a history of anaphylactic reactions to that ingredient, there were I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, but don't quote me on this, I think it was in the clinical trials, it was 9 for every 770,000 or to a million vaccinated that had a reaction to it. And that's why they ask you to stay in the clinic for 15 minutes after, so that if you do have a reaction, they can treat it. So I guess to answer your question, it would be if you have a history of reactions to any of the ingredients that are listed, then I would speak to my personal physician first to see whether they would recommend another vaccine. But in terms of timing, I think it also depends on, we have some data on people who are immunosuppressed or people who are taking immunosuppressants because they have cancer, for example, or an autoimmune condition. And it's not that the vaccine is unsafe. It's just because a lot of those treatments will impact the B cells that you're able to mount or some of the immune compartments that you're able to mount. So it just means that in those people, the vaccine is just not as effective. And so in terms of timing, nothing that's springing out at the top of my head, but it's more in terms of getting it or not. It depends on if you have a condition or if you're immunosuppressed, etc. It just might mean that the vaccine may not work for you. And then you'll have to rely on herd immunity, which is the majority of the population vaccinating so that, or having those memory responses so that the virus isn't able to get through those people to infect you, which is what the concept of herd immunity is.
Yeah. And I recognize that even just this idea of being able to consider our timing is a privilege because there are a lot of people in our countries who don't even have accessibility to the vaccine yet.
Yes.
So I feel obviously extremely grateful for that. And I just know that a lot of my clients, a lot of people in my network are thinking, especially women who want to get pregnant, when is the right time for me to get this vaccine? It's a question I get all the time. So thank you so much for taking the time to answer that one. And is there anything special you do before you get a vaccine?
I mean, with this vaccine, I cried a little bit just because after the last year that we've all had, I think it was just such a relief, and I also got the J&J vaccine like you. So, but in general, no, I think that the general advice is that if you experience any side effects that you can take Tylenol or Advil afterwards. But I think that in terms of preparing for it, I would just hydrate a lot and do the things that work for you and do the things that even if you take supplements, if you exercise, things that make you feel good, just to make sure that you feel good going into it. And just so that if you do happen to get any side effects, which I think we talked about, but a lot of them are expected effects, right? Because we talked about your innate immune system needing to be overwhelmed enough to activate adaptive, and that in some people will come with symptoms. So if you do get symptoms, it's just good to make sure that you've done the best that you can to feel good before those onset.
Right. Like get enough sleep,
Yes.
don't drink a bunch the night before and,
Yes.
just the things that bring health to your body. Do those, you're not the first person who told me that they cried when they got their vaccine. That's it's been a big deal for everybody. So there are different kinds of vaccines, and I know that there are different understandings in the public of what each of the vaccines are doing. There's the RNA vaccines, there's the mRNA vaccines, and then I think the Russian vaccine's doing something weird, but we don't need to talk about that because I think probably most of my audience is in the US and Europe and probably Australia. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between the vaccines and specifically how the mRNA ones are different?
Yep. So I can start by, so messenger, a very basic tenet in biology is that you have DNA to mRNA to protein, right? So you start with the DNA code, that gets translated to messenger RNA or to RNA. And then after the RNA is then used to make protein, and it's folded in the right way. Like it's used to make the protein itself, and the protein is folded in the right way and then released, right? So you have something in your cells called ribosomes that you can think of as 3D printers. And they sit in your cytoplasm. So they sit outside of your nucleus, and your nucleus is like the lockbox where your DNA is. And these ribosomes, their job is every time the cell expresses a gene and it needs a protein, it sends a list of ingredients, messenger RNA. It sends like a recipe to the ribosomes. The ribosomes read it, and then they'll 3D print a protein, package it in the right way for the cell to do what it needs to with it. And so messenger RNA is something that our cells, use millions and trillions of times a day. All of your cells need it. It's something that you can just think of it as like a recipe, or kind of like a snapshot of a recipe that the ribosome or the 3D printers will read. And so what these vaccines are, the mRNA vaccines, is that they have the mRNA, so that for the spike protein, so a recipe for the spike protein, and it's encapsulated in 4 lipids, right? And so it's that bubble is and all the other ingredients, which again, Heather, I'm happy to send over just so that you have it if anyone's interested. But all of the other ingredients are in really low doses, and they're stabilizers like salts and sugars and etc. And so what happens is that when you get injected with the messenger RNA vaccine, and that's the Pfizer or the Moderna, that bubble goes into your cell, and then you have the messenger RNA goes to the ribosome. The ribosome will read the recipe, and it will start to make the spike protein, and it will fold it in the right way, make the spike protein, and then that moves to the surface of the cell, and then it's held out. You can think of it as like a fist out, and then your innate immune responses that are walking past will say, hey, this thing is in the body, we need to get it out. Okay. So meaning that it's a very similar process to natural infection, but it's not the whole virus, it's just the spike protein. And in fact, the natural virus itself, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, is when we were saying that viruses will hijack cell machinery to make more of itself, that's one of the mechanisms that the virus itself hijacks anyway. It hijacks your ribosomes to make more protein for itself in order to continue to infect other cells. And so the messenger RNA is, the entire scientific field is excited about it because A, it's safer, meaning that it's not going anywhere near nucleus where your DNA is. But just a comforting thought is that it's DNA to RNA to protein. We don't make the enzyme naturally that allows for that to go backwards. It's not possible. And you can think of DNA as an avocado and messenger RNA as guacamole. Once you make all of the edits and you've added all the stuff in, it's really difficult to stuff the guacamole back and make the avocado again, right? It's impossible. And so all to say that even if that messenger RNA by some fluke were to find its way into the nucleus, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to integrate, and it's not going to go backwards, right? And so the messenger RNA vaccines have actually been in development for a really long time, for about 3 decades. We actually do have data. Originally, it was a technology that was developed for cancer. So a way to get tumor cells to express specific proteins so that the immune system can target it naturally and attack it. And so we have data going back in cancer patients to 2013. And so it's been in development for a really long time. And so it's not a brand new technology, but it is the first time it's received authorization for a range of reasons, but mainly because a lot of clinical trials take a long time because you need to find the right patient populations to recruit in. So with other vaccine trials, they'll last 10 years because you need to find people with Zika or Ebola in order to recruit into the clinical trials. With SARS-CoV-2, we managed to go through recruitment really quickly because it's so prevalent. So that allowed the trials to move much faster. But also just conceptually and biologically, it's a much safer mechanism, right? Because you're going right to the ribosome, the cell itself is moderating it, and then the immune system is doing its thing that it would do anyway. So that's how the messenger RNA vaccines work. In terms of the Johnson & Johnson and also Astrazeneca vaccines, these use an adenovirus vector. So this is technology we've used for other vaccines in the past before. And what they do is that we identified a virus from chimpanzees that isn't able to infect human cells. And also the scientists do a deletion to prevent it from being able to make more of itself, right? And so these adenovirus vectors, you can think of them as escorting the DNA for the spike protein. So it's a step back from the mRNA vaccines. And so what happens is when you get injected with those, the spike protein DNA is escorted into the nucleus by the adenovirus vector. And then it doesn't integrate because this is a chimpanzee virus that doesn't integrate into human DNA. But you can think of it as like borrowing the tools in the nucleus in order to make that messenger RNA for the spike protein, which is then released, goes to the ribosome. The ribosome makes the spike protein and exhibits it on the surface. And so I think this will maybe help people understand why mRNA technology is really exciting, because it means that the application for even other treatments are endless. It means that we can essentially use the cell itself as a factory. So it's your immune system regulating the process. And so it's incredibly safe, and it's just like way faster of a mechanism. And so those are the vaccines that have been authorized in Europe, in the US, and I'm not sure about Australia actually.
Thanks for taking the time to explain that. And I know it's a lot for people to understand. And the thing that I love about this, this is going to sound like a statement to even start it like that. The thing I love about this pandemic, is that people are actually learning a lot more about the human body through it, and also learning that there are things that we can do to take care of ourselves that will actually result in us having a more favorable immune response to things, whether you get the vaccine or the virus itself. Last question. Azza, thank you so much for everything you've shared so far. But I'd love to know, I named my podcast The Wisdom of the Body, and I love hearing from my guests what that means to them. So what does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
Oh, that's a really good question. So I think for me personally, I'm just going to tell you the first thing that comes to mind. It's that, obviously I've spent a lot of time thinking about the immune system, and I'm just consistently blown away, I think I mentioned earlier, by all of the potential things that can go wrong, and just how incredible it is at preventing those things from going wrong. So I would say that the wisdom of the human body is, I think, to trust kind of the complexity of your immune system. But I think that at the same time, to keep in mind that there are ways that you can work with it, right? That you can collaborate with it. And so even things like a vaccine, you're essentially presenting something to the immune system to allow it to do its thing that it does anyway, millions of times a day. So for me, I would say that the wisdom of the human body is trusting in your body and in your immune system, and learning as much as you can about it and how complex it is, but at the same time, collaborating with it as much as you can.
That sounds like really good advice. Azza, is there anything that you feel we didn't cover today that you'd love to communicate?
Something that recently, because I've been spending a lot of time with friends that are, frontline healthcare workers, another piece to it for me is I think that because this virus was so infectious, it was hard to have cameras in the hospital rooms, right? And I think that everybody who lost somebody to it or knew somebody who got very sick could kind of see what was at stake. But yeah, I would also just like to remind everybody, and including myself, that the people on the front line, they've been overworked, exhausted, and then also very traumatized, scenes of being exposed to people that are that sick over and over again. And, I think that we have to remind ourselves to think of them and also do the best that we can as a community in order to kind of lower the burden off them and just take as much off their trauma that they've experienced over the last year as we can by trying to get rid of this virus together and collectively. And actually, I'll give you one more thing that you can choose to include, which is the microbiome is a good example of how we're not siloed. We're not siloed beings, bacteria aren't siloed either. They work with each other for the greater good of the community. And similarly, I mean, it's cheesy, but human beings are also not siloed. And I think that's something that this pandemic has really highlighted, that the actions of one impact the many. And so, yeah, I'm hoping to see, more fortified community, if anything, coming out of this pretty dire year that we've all had.
I'm so happy you mentioned that. Thank you so much, Azza. And in fact, when last year it was so crazy, I don't know why, but like 75% of my clients were medical doctors. And I felt like, I'm not on the front line, but I can support them in this way. So definitely, I think that it's very understandable to think that somebody working on the front line would have a very, very, very different experience of this pandemic. And we do need to support them. Thank you so much. So thank you so much for being here, Azza, and I look forward to speaking with you again.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on The Wisdom of the Body.